Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Kraus Scholar Series. This is the fifth and final installment of this wonderful experience that we've been having as part of our Decade of Distinction celebration for 10 years that Cantor Azu and I have been at Temple Shalom of Naples. I'm Rabbi Miller, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you, as well as our special guest tonight, Rabbi David Ellenson. This series has been a remarkable opportunity for us to bring in scholars from all over to be a part of our community. I want to thank Henry Kraus for making this possible. Henry and his wife Shirley of blessed memory started our Kraus Scholarship Fund for Scholar in Residence many years ago, and thanks to their generosity, our community has been blessed to have many of the leading lights of the Jewish community come and visit us. We're even blessed to have Rabbi Ellenson a few years ago as our Scholar in Residence for a full weekend. But there's a special reason why I picked him to be a part of this series, and I'll explain that in a moment. In addition to Henry, I want to thank the co-chairs of the Scholar Series, David Citron and Dr. Lydia Bond, as well as our hosts for tonight, Mel and Judy Zahn, and Arthur and Susan Sussman, who welcomed Rabbi Ellenson remotely. We certainly wish that he could be here with us in person, but during this time of COVID, we're trying to do our welcoming and warmth virtually to be able to bring people in. This has been a wonderful celebration for us of learning, and I am delighted to have Rabbi Ellenson because of my personal connection with him. His formal bio would tell you that he is the Chancellor Emeritus, as well as the I.H. and Anna Gransell Professor Emeritus of Jewish Religious Thought at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. HUC-JIR is the Reform Seminary in North America, and he was the president of HUC-JIR from 2001 to 2013, and then served again following the tragic death of Rabbi Aaron Pankin from 2018 to 2019. He's been a professor of Near Eastern Studies and Judaic Studies at Brandeis. He has his PhD from Columbia and was ordained from Hebrew Union College. Those are just some of the basics. I could list all the many books and publications, though we wouldn't actually get to hear from Rabbi Ellenson and his remarkable Southern Virginia drawl that always draws in his audience. For me, my first connection with Rabbi Ellenson began during my year in Israel. I don't know if he even remembers this part of the story. He was there on sabbatical. It was 97, 98, and was introduced to the new class of rabbis, cantors, and educators who were there. Well, one of them had the chutzpah to walk up to him afterwards and ask if they could do independent study because they had been a philosophy major in college and really wanted to get some deeper learning with Rabbi Ellenson because he was from the LA campus. They weren't going to the LA campus, and would it work out? Well, luckily for me, he said yes. And we began a semester-long independent study on Jewish feminism and Jewish thinkers, people like Blue Greenberg and Rachel Adler and others were introduced to me by Rabbi Ellenson, and I'm forever grateful for that first introduction to those wonderful American Jewish thinkers, some of whom might pop up again tonight as part of our conversation. Then, while I was at HUC, he became the president, and I was fortunate enough in 2003 to have him with me on the Bima at Temple Emmanuel of New York City, Congregation Emmanuel of New York City, where he ordained me as a rabbi. It has been always my privilege to be able to learn with Rabbi Ellenson, to take classes from him, to study with him, and now to be able to have, as the fifth and final installment in our Scholar Series, my friend, mentor, and teacher, Rabbi David Ellenson, be our guest tonight. Welcome, Rabbi Ellenson.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm very honored to be here, and especially Rabbi Miller, to be able to honor you and the cantor. And I'm going to even add, of course, Rabbi Boxman. I had the very, very distinct privilege of giving all of you little kisses on your kepis to ordain you as rabbis and cantors among the Jewish people. And I remember, of course, very, very positively how wonderful it was to come and be your guest in Naples several years ago. And I do feel your warmth. I want to thank everyone for greeting me so warmly, and hope that as this COVID pandemic comes to an end, Im Yirzeh Hashem, as they say, God willing, that I'll have another opportunity to come down and bask in your warmth in person at another point in the future. But
if we could ship the warm weather to you, we would.
But it is really, really wonderful to be with you and to be among such distinguished scholars, Jill Amy Levin, and Rabbi Prezan, Norman Cohen, who of course was provost of Hebrew Union during my time as president for the first 8 years of my presidency, and of course Rabbi Gary Zola, the inimitable expert on American Jewish history and head of the American Jewish Archives, which is really the major repository for the study of the American Jewish experience. To be among such a group of distinguished scholars, I really am honored to be here. And I thank you as well, you and the rabbi and the cantor, for this opportunity, not only to honor you for all of your work in Naples, but to thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about the most recent book that I have completed. This book, entitled American Jewish Thought Since 1934, is part of the Brandeis University series, Library of Modern Jewish Thought. It may be, Adam, you could just put the title up for a second. We can take a look at it, and I'll be pictured on the side. If you could share the book title. Let me say a bit about the book. To begin with, as you can see, it is edited with Rabbi Michael Marmer. Michael was for many years the dean at Hebrew Union in Jerusalem. Michael was born in Britain, was ordained a rabbi at HUC in Jerusalem after making Aliyah in 1984, and then received a master's degree in ancient Jewish history at the University of Haifa, and then received his PhD at Hebrew University. And Michael is an expert on Abraham Joshua Heschel. In 2009, when Rabbi Norman Cohen retired as provost of HUC, our chief academic officer, Michael succeeded Norman as provost of HUC. And it was really my great, great pleasure to work not only with Norman, but also Michael at the College Institute. And hence, when I was asked by Brandeis to write this book on American Jewish thought, I thought that, well, the best way to go about doing this would be to work with a colleague for whom I had tremendous respect and with whom I had an excellent friendship. And Michael immediately came to mind. I have to say that one of the things that I missed the most about not being president of the College Institute was not all of the responsibility for the administration of the College Institute, but I actually missed many of the people with whom I worked virtually daily. For 8 years, I would say that Norman Cohen and I spoke 3 to 4 times a week. And from 2008-9, when Michael became provost, until my retirement at the beginning of 2014, Michael and I spoke again 3, 4, 5 times a week. So this book gave us a wonderful opportunity to be together again and to think about a topic that meant a great deal to us. I'm going to give you a lot of information about the book today, and I will even confess that the book is written in large measure with the hopes that people like your rabbis and cantor will have an opportunity to instruct groups like yours in adult education at your temple throughout the country on issues in American Jewish thought. Now, one of the issues is that the book itself was limited to 110,000 words. That may sound like a lot, but given the totality of American Jewish thought, if we were to have gone back entirely to the colonial period, we really could not have contained all the different thinkers who might have been represented in this work. So consequently, Michael and I did make a decision that we would begin our book with 1934, and I will explain why that is significant in one moment, though I might as well say it at the very outset. That is the year that Mordechai Kaplan, the great Reconstructionist thinker who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary from 1909 to 1953, it was in 1934 that Rabbi Kaplan published his work, Judaism as a Civilization. So we decided that we wanted to use Kaplan as the Archimedean, as the starting point for our own reflections on American Jewish thought. So hence the title 1934. It meant that we excluded people like Henrietta Zold, Solomon Schechter, Helen Lindman, Kaufman Kohler, who was president of Hebrew Union and wrote a work of systematic Jewish theology. So all of these types of thinkers, Isaac Mayer Wise, were excluded from this book because we focused actually on the last 80 years of American Jewish thought. The other decision that we had to make, precisely because there was a limitation in terms of words, was that we did make a decision to not have the book focus completely on persons who were extremely well known. In other words, Joseph Soloveitchik among the Orthodox, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Mordechai Kaplan, Eugene Borowitz, David Hartman, Judith Plaskow, Rachel Adler, Lou Greenberg, who Rabbi Miller mentioned before. All of these are people with whom most of us are familiar, who are engaged in the project of American Jewish thought. We thought it was important to include all of these thinkers, but we did not want to limit our book to these thinkers alone. And we made the decision to include a number of thinkers, and I'll talk about them in a moment, who are not yet that well known, but on the other hand, who have written very, very significant works. And we thought that it was very important that we introduce these persons to the American Jewish community through our book. So those are the first overarching words that I would offer. I would also say that Michael and I worked on this reader for almost 3 years, going through thousands of pages of work. We made the decision that we would look at thinkers not only in the United States, but of course to us, America meant Canada as well. And we did make the decision to include people like David Hartman or Tamar Ross, who made Aliyah to Israel, but whose work has been quite significant in its influence on American Jews and American Jewish thinkers. Certainly many of our rabbis and rabbinic students would be familiar with these people who, albeit that they lived in Israel, nevertheless were educated often in the United States, and their work has been very well known, particularly in intellectual religious circles in America. So with that said, why don't we turn to the table of contents so that we can get a notion of the diversity of thought. So thank you, Adam. So first, we're going to look at the first 3 sections of the book. The book was divided into 7 sections. The sections overlap with each other. For example, if you move from God to Revelation and Commandment, the 2 sections overlap completely. Spirituality is an area where, again, people like Soloveitchik had a great deal to say in other areas of thought, and hence we wanted to indicate that in our table of contents, we were not trying to say that there are rigid lines among all of these different sections in our book, but rather we would indicate that there is a great deal of permeability among all of these sections, and it would be important for anyone using the book to look, frankly, at the back, at the index, and see where the overlap comes. In addition, even as we included 10 to 11 sections in each section of our book, what we had to do was make a decision about how to take the essence of a person's work in order to present their views on a given topic. What that means in large measure is that someone like Mordechai Kaplan, but this would be true of any of our thinkers, wrote a 400-page book on the future of the American Jew, and we give you 3 to 5 pages of each of these thinkers. So that is to say, if someone were genuinely interested in any of these thinkers, we would hope that your teachers, your rabbis, your professors would be able to point you further in the direction of what these people wrote. At the same time, we hope that in relationship to each of these thinkers, we did present the major thrust of their thought on a given topic. I would also say that we saw that our table of contents frankly changed. There were times where we had 8 or 9 sections, times where we had 4 or 5. We ended up with the 7 that I'll present to you this evening. But we also recognize that there would have been other ways to organize this book. The book moves in a very real sense from classical conceptions of God and Torah, and it will conclude in the last section with the idea of Jewish peoplehood. So the book goes largely from God to Torah to issues of peoplehood, and we'll talk about sections that we think have a great deal in common with the total history of Jewish religious and intellectual thought, and some sections that we believe are quintessentially American. We also wanted this book to provide a great deal of diversity. And as a result, someone has asked us at different times, are there people whose views that you, David and Michael, personally disagreed with, who we included in the book? And the only answer I would give to that is that almost everyone in the book, we felt we learned from them, but simultaneously, there are a lot of opinions that we find very, very problematic, and people who take stances with which we are not comfortable whatsoever, but we felt that they represented positions that American Jews have taken over the last 80 years, and that students of American Jewish thought should be aware of all this. In addition, wherever there were direct debates between thinkers, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, we presented both of these thinkers so that, again, in a class or an individual reading the book could consider the different viewpoints of these persons. Move back to the first page again, please, Adam. So I just want to begin by looking at a couple of the sections to give you an idea of who we included and why. We begin the book with Mordechai Kaplan. In some measure, we did this because the book starts, as I said, from 1934 and Kaplan's Judaism as a Civilization. Those of you who know anything about Reconstructionist thought are probably aware that Kaplan, who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, as I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Kaplan did not believe in the notion of a personal God. On the other hand, his colleague at JTS, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was completely committed to the notion of a personal God. Consequently, we began the book with Kaplan representing the yin, and as it were, Heschel representing the yang. That is to say, we began the book with an individual who begins with the notion of a highly impersonal deity, with the idea of God, and then Heschel, who believed very much in the notion of a personal God who is impacted by humankind. So that at the very outset of the book, the kind of dialogue and diversity which we hope the book captures would be there. We then went on to Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was a great scholar from Germany of the the early rabbinic and Greco-Roman period, the first centuries of the Common Era. Jonas was a refugee from Germany. He was one of the last people ordained a rabbi at the Hochschule, the liberal rabbinical college in Berlin. Jonas writes about the concept of God after Auschwitz. We then move to Richard Rubinstein, who is a professor emeritus and taught for many years in your state of Florida at Florida State University, who is most well known, famous, or infamous as the Jewish death of God theologian. Namely, Rubinstein made the claim that after the Holocaust, the belief in an individual God who enters history on behalf of the people Israel, precisely what we sing about in our services every week, when we recite the Micha Mocha prayer and say, who is like you among the gods, Adonai, that God was, as Rubinstein put it, disconfirmed empirically by the Holocaust. Namely, the fact that the Jews were killed in a genocide indicates, as Rubinstein put it, that there is no personal God who enters into history. In opposition to that, we have the Orthodox theologian Eliezer Berkovitz, who was also a German Jewish refugee. Rabbi Berkovitz taught for many, many years at the Orthodox Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois. Dr. Berkovitz represents the continued affirmation of Jewish faith despite the Holocaust. So again, our aim here to create diversity remains primary. Erich Fromm, of course, the great secular philosopher, represents a humanistic point of view. Marcia Falk, a feminist thinker, has her own views of a naturalistic God that stem in some ways and echo the views of Mordechai Kaplan, but of course, with a highly feminist kind of an approach, and we can talk about what that means later, but to speak of God in relational, not hierarchical terms. And then Edward Greenstein, a professor at Tel Aviv University in Bar Ilan in Israel, but who was trained in the United States at Columbia, who's quite critical of Falk. We then turn to Sandra Lubarsky and Rebecca Alpert, who represent the positions of process theology, and Rebecca Alpert, prepositional theology. Namely, Rabbi Alpert, a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, says that the way in which we know God is through the preposition we attach to God. God is kind, God is good, God is moral. It's to say then that morality, ethics, kindness, that is really what is God-like. But again, far removed from a personal vision of God. So that part of what we hope in this section is that modern Jews will see that contemporary American Jewish thinkers have thought about God in a wide variety of ways. We also want to indicate that in this book, you can see that we have approximately 10 to 11 selections in each section of the book. Part of that means that allows us to see the diversity of thought that is represented. I would also add that you can note there are a number of women in this section. The book contains 79 selections by 73 thinkers. Prior to 1980, I think the only woman who we included was a selection by Hannah Arendt. After 1980, 26 of the approximately 50 persons selected were women. It demonstrates how the public voice of women has come to be so prominent within the American Jewish community over the last 40 years. But I just wanted to point this out. Out of the total of 73 authors in the book, 26 are women. And with a few exceptions, Judith Plaskow, Rachel Adler, Kaplan, Heschel, Soloveitchik, we did not include more than one selection by any thinker. We wanted to introduce a wide variety of persons. We then moved to Revelation and Commandment. After all, after discussing God, then the question is, how is God's will understood by humanity? And we began with two Orthodox thinkers, Marvin Fox and Aharon Lichtenstein, who put forth, I would say, very traditional views of Revelation, where God is seen as the source of commandment. We then moved to Will Herberg. One point I want to make, Herberg wrote a book that was very influential in the 1950s and early 60s. One book was Protestant Catholic Jew, the other Judaism, and at that time he wrote Modern Man. I'm sure it would be re-entitled today to be more gender inclusive. But one of the key points I want to also make is we did not call our book the American Jewish Canon. In other words, is there an official body of literature that attains what one might call canonical status within Judaism? Rather, we chose the looser term, American Jewish thought, because we wanted to indicate that it's hard to know whose thought will be significant in an ongoing way. Milton Steinberg, the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, when Will Herberg's book came out, said that Judaism and Modern Man would be the most significant theological work written in mid-century in the United States. Today, almost no one in the world looks at Herberg's writing. We included it for its historical import, but one should note it means that trying to define a work as canonical is very, very difficult. We then moved to Jacob Pedachowski, professor at the college, Rabbi Soloveitchik, the great Orthodox thinker. Benjamin Sommer is a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he approaches the authority of the commandments from a conservative standpoint, and I may talk about that later. We then moved to the Orthodox feminist, Tamar Ross from Bar Ilan, and then our teacher, who taught many of us and many of your rabbis, Eugene Borowitz, whose work, Renewing the Covenant, is the major statement of Reformed Jewish thought in the 20th century. And then we get responses to him by both Susan Handelman, an Orthodox woman who teaches now at Bar Ilan and who formerly taught at the University of Maryland, and David Novak, a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who are both critical of Borowitz's notions of covenant. We end up with a young, modern Jewish feminist thinker, Mara Benjamin, who is head of Jewish studies at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and of course, Rachel Adler, professor of Jewish thought at Hebrew Union College in LA, whose book, Engendering Judaism, is genuinely a classic in modern Jewish thought, and I can talk about all of these works later. The third section, spirituality, and this is interesting. This would not have been a section in a book written 20 or 30 years ago. Indeed, when we did our examination of the literature, we found that there was almost nothing written about spirituality prior to the 1980s. But from the year 2000 on, if you were to Google books in Jewish spirituality, over half the books in Jewish religious thought today fall under the category of spirituality. So that this is an area where clearly contemporaneous events in the United States have had a tremendous impact on Jewish thinkers. The major thinker in this, I would say, in many ways, is Arthur Green. Art Green defines spirituality as the attempt to live consciously in the presence of God. The attempt to live consciously in the presence of God. And you can see in this section that you have any number of people, Daniel Matt, Rabbi Zalman Schachter, Shalomi, and others, Marcia Prager, a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. All of these people reflect modern directions, contemporaneous directions in Jewish thinking. We then moved to Nancy Flam, a graduate of the college, who was one of the founders of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And I would add that Rabbi Flam is really the individual who began the notion of healing services, which of course are standard in many of our congregations today, but it was Rabbi Flam who really began this with Arthur Waskow. We begin to talk about ecology, eco-Judaism, eco-kashrut. All of these represent significant directions in contemporary Jewish thought. Let's move to section 4. We then move to a section that serves as the place, I would say, of another direction in our thinking. We call this hermeneutics and politics. Think of the Walt Disney movie. Hermeneutics only means interpretation. One of the things that happen is when you get a PhD in religion, or you go to rabbinical or school of the seminary, you no longer talk about interpretation. You have to use the word hermeneutics to indicate that you are educated, one might say, in the guild of religious thinkers. But hermeneutics really mean modes of interpretation. And you can see the work by David Hartman, A Heart of Many Rooms. And part of what we attempt to say there, as Rabbi Hartman put it, is that there are many modes of interpretation. Think of what you learn each week with your rabbis, cantors, and teachers when you study Torah. Turn it over and over again. Hafochba v'hafochba ki kulaba. There are numerous interpretations of Torah and the tradition. Consequently, we wanted to indicate that the way in which one interprets the tradition may also have something to do with one's politics. And that's why we included people like Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt, but also Michael Walzer. We're about to enter Passover. Walzer, of course, is the great political theorist and editor of Dissent magazine, who was at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. His work, Exodus and Revolution, we use him almost liturgically in our day. We know that wherever we are, as Dr. Walzer puts it, is Egypt, that there is a better place, and that our task is to strive to create it. We end this section with Jill Jacobs and Meir Kahana. Jill Jacobs is head of Teruah. She is a young graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. She represents a progressive voice in the Jewish world. After her, we include Meir Kahana, Rabbi Meir Kahana, who was, I think, by virtually any standard, considered to be a difficult personage by many, a controversial one within the Jewish community. He took what many people describe as racist positions in relationship to the Arab minority in Israel. Michael and I often kidded that if we had a dinner party and we could have called our book, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, what would it mean to have seated certain people next to each other? And we imagine that if Rabbi Jill Jacobs sat next to Rabbi Meir Kahana, we don't think they would have gotten through drinking the water together before there would have been an argument that would have caused one or both of them to leave. But again, we felt that Kahana represented a position within the American Jewish landscape, and it was important, therefore, to include it. The next section deals with the Holocaust in Israel. I want to be quite clear about what I'm saying now. The creation of the State of Israel and the Zionist movement predate the Holocaust. The Holocaust does not create Zionism, but an American Jewish thought, and we begin with an essay by Jacob Neusner, the great scholar who taught for many years at Brown University. But Professor Neusner, who passed away several years ago, made the point that while classical rabbinic Judaism rests on the notion of a written and an oral Torah, that modern American Judaism rests on the notion in the 20th century of a different type of twofold revelation, not the written law and the oral law, not the written Torah, what we call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament, but that it represents in our day destruction, the genocide of the Jewish people through the Holocaust, and then ultimately the redemption of our people through the establishment of the state of Israel. So that in Jewish thought, in America, the two come to be linked to one another. And again, we include a number of different thinkers, the Satmar Rebbe, who saw Zionism as a heresy, Emil Fackenheim, the great German, Canadian, Israeli philosopher, Rabbi Berkovitz again, David Blumenthal from Emory University, and others. We also included in here Judith Butler, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, who completely condemns Zionism as a project of what she calls settler colonialism. And we oppose to her Ruth Weiss, who feels that the problem is not that the Jews do not have a right to the land of Israel, but that the Palestinians have been obdurate and refuse to recognize legitimacy of the Jewish state whatsoever. Again, Butler and Weiss are 180 degrees apart from one another. Then Daniel Gordis, the Boyarin brothers, who affirm the import of the diaspora. And we conclude that section with Peter Beinart, the modern commentator, whose views are not identical in any way to Judith Butler, but who is quite critical of Israeli policy, particularly on the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, and the editors of commentary who critique Beinart as what they call a conditional Zionist. So that again, we have a great deal of diversity. We then move to issues of feminism, gender, and sexuality. All of these selections emerge after 1980. Susanna Heschel's major work on being a Jewish feminist, a debate between Cynthia Ozick and Judith Plaskow, who Rabbi Miller mentioned earlier, over the import of feminism and is it a theological question? Lou Greenberg, who represents an Orthodox position, Rachel Adler, again, our professor at HUC, who wrote a famous essay, I've Had Nothing Yet, so I Can't Take More. And finally, we used a more contemporaneous thinker, Julia Belzer, who's a professor at Georgetown University. Belzer is a rabbi and also a PhD in Talmud from Berkeley. And her works, Making Room for the Divine She and Privilege and Disaster, represent the positions of more contemporaneous feminist thinkers, and it represents the evolution in feminist thought. We then move to, in quotes, queer theologians within Judaism, Stephen Greenberg, an Orthodox rabbi, and Jay Michelson, a conservative Jew, B'nai Lappe, a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who's head of a yeshiva called Svara, the new rabbis who represents, in quotes, a queer position, and then discussions of transgender sexuality with Rabbi Jane Littman of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and Joy Ladin. Joy Ladin, interestingly, is the very first transgendered woman to be a professor at Yeshiva University in New York City. She's a professor of English there. So again, emphasis on gender and sexuality emerges out of feminist thought. And again, this would not have been present in a work 40 years earlier. Finally, we move to the whole concept of Jewish peoplehood. I'm going to just mention 4 essays in particular, one by Shaul Magid. Magid argues in American Post-Judaism that we've entered a post-ethnic phase of American Jewish life, that we live in a world where the Pew study shows 80% of our non-Orthodox population marry people who were born non-Jewish. The Pew study recently showed the following. There are 4.2 million people in America who say, when asked the question, are you Jewish and is your religion Jewish? 4.2 million people answer, yes, I am a Jew and my religion is Judaism. 1.1 million people answer, I am a Jew and I have no religion. So there are 5.3 million people in America who say, I am Jewish and I have no other religion other than Judaism, though 1.1 million say they're not Jewish religiously. There are another million people who answer the question, are you Jewish? And say, yes, I am Jewish, but I am a member of another religion, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. Again, from the standpoint of, I'm going to call it here, elite rabbinic thought, that's highly problematic, but sociologically, that's a reality of the world we live in. And there are another 2.2 million people who, when asked the question, are you Jewish, answer no, but they live in the Jewish community. They are married to Jews. They are step-parents of Jews. They themselves may not have converted to Judaism, but they are part of the Jewish community. They may well be in attendance at your temple, and they may well be bringing their children, grandchildren, cousins, nephews, nieces for bar and bat mitzvah lessons. So the question is this a positive, in quotes, or a negative development in Jewish life? Magid, who teaches at Dartmouth, thinks that it is good that we live in a post-ethnic age and that this ultimately will benefit the Jewish people. Stephen Cohen, who formerly taught at the Hebrew Union College, and Jack Wertheimer of the Jewish Theological Seminary, you can look at their question. What is so great about post-ethnic Judaism? And whatever happened to the Jewish people? They are critical of these trends and feel that these trends are detrimental to the future growth of American Judaism. And Magid, Cohen, and Wertheimer argue directly with one another. We then move to Arthur Hertzberg and Paula Hyman, who write immediately after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995. And their claim is that our community, politically at least, is absolutely no longer one. We then move to Diane Kohler-Esses, who is the first Syrian woman to ever be ordained as a rabbi. And she talks about the issues that arise as we try to consider the Sephardic and Syrian heritage of the Jewish people, and what does it mean to look at our people beyond Ashkenazic normativity. And then Lewis Gordon, whose mother is a Jamaican Jewish woman, represents, again, persons of color. Michael and I fully expect that when another volume of this work is written, in 10, 15, 20 years, there will be far more many Sephardic thinkers and persons of color than are represented in our volume, and perhaps even more women, so that we can look at all of these sections and see the diversity of thought that marks American Judaism in our day. With this, let me stop and ask you, rabbis and Cantor and persons who are on here, we can go back to the main screen now, that'll be fine. If there are any questions or comments or thoughts that any of you have at this moment. I know it took a long time to get through all of that, but I hope this gives you an idea of the notions that served as our framework for this work and the diversity of thought that marks the American Jewish community today and over the past 80 years. So if there are questions or comments, I'm really open at this point. So Rabbi Miller.
So thank you, Rabbi Ellenson, for starting us off there and for giving us the overview of American Jewish thought since 1934. For those who want to pose questions, as we said in the chat, you can put them in the Q&A tab, and I'll pose those to Rabbi Ellenson as we go along. One question that's come up as you look at some of those names and some of the personalities who you've brought into this book, I wonder, have you interacted with those authors and asked them how they feel about being in a book where their views might not be represented by the person next to them, much less those who are further along?
Well, it's a very interesting question. One of the challenges in writing this book is that Michael or I probably know half the people in the book quite well personally. In addition, there are people with whom we are extremely close. Rabbi Brad Artson, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, for example, of the American Jewish University. We have books of theirs that we mention in the bibliography at the end, but we did not include selections from them in the part of our book, though we do talk about them in the introduction. And in fact, Rabbi Marmer and I are currently teaching a course at HUC, and one of the assignments is, who would you have put in the book that we did not put in the book? The challenge too was that when we took selections from people, we then sent them to them and said, is this a fair summation? Does it represent the major thrust of your thought? I would say that 3 out of 4 said, you got it exactly right. 1 out of 4 said, no, this is a distortion. It represents too small a version of my argument and it doesn't present it fully. And in those cases, we attempted to amend it. There were people like Susanna Heschel, who wrote a subsequent essay. We used her introduction from her 1983 book on being a Jewish feminist, but she wrote a revised introduction in 1995 to the second edition of the book. We allude to that in the book, but we use the 1983 edition because we thought that for students of American Jewish thought, that it might be optimal to see the original work that she had written, or in regard to Jay Michelson, who wrote a work towards a queer Jewish theology. He too wrote a later work, which probably does represent a more sophisticated version of his argument. But again, we elected to use the earlier one because we hope that students of this material who are interested will look at the later iteration of the work, but we thought it was significant. We thought it was significant to indicate to students how this thought had first evolved. Obviously, in relationship to feminism, we're in a much, much different position today than we were 40 years ago. And here I would also say that I've given you a very, as it were, academic overview of our work tonight, but I want to really indicate to you that these are really highly personal issues for many of us. The Holocaust in Israel, I'll just say it. I find Judith Butler's views to be an anathema to my own position. I don't particularly like Meir Kahane. In relationship to feminism, gender, and sexuality, I'm very, very much influenced by the women I've spoken to over the years and the fact that in a patriarchal culture, women were not allowed to speak out publicly prior to the last few decades. These are views about which people have, I think, very visceral reactions, so that I don't want to pretend that one thinks about these issues only in rational, but in emotional kinds of ways. And most of the people we know get kind of, like Jill Jacobs gets a laugh out of being next to Meir Kahane. So we're appreciative when people show that kind of humor. Other people have said to us, well, I would have put different people in than you did. And we can only say yes. We understand.
You only had 110,000 words to work with. You can't get
yes,
everybody.
Well, that, by the way, is not an insignificant
yeah.
part. So any other questions or
comments? Sure, there are questions coming in, and I certainly have some as well, and we'll kind of moderate between them. So Felicia writes in to ask if you can reflect on the transition from intellectual consideration into impact on practice. How do you see that relationship?
What a good question. I think that in many cases, what we see is that you have notions of intellectual thought, and sometimes it can take years before these thoughts practically become realized or reach fruition. Look, in the political realm, you had the Federalist Society that began to think about the question, how do we create a conservative judiciary? in America. And it took any number of years, but obviously during President Trump's administration, these ideas that predated by decades the appointment of judges during the past administration, they come to find practical expression here. I would say similarly, Kaplan's notions of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish community. Today, the notion that a synagogue should be in many ways a synagogue center and speak to persons in cultural as well as religious terms, that synagogues should be, as it were, centers of Jewish life in addition to being houses of prayer. Those things are a direct reflection of Kaplan's thought. Think of issues of feminism. Remember that when people like Blue Greenberg, Rachel Adler, and Plaskow were first writing, women had virtually no public role in American Jewish life. Today, we're honoring a cantor and a rabbi, both of whom are women. That represents a direct outgrowth of what these people were writing about. Today, at the Hebrew Union College, almost half our faculty are women. During my years at HUC, there were quite frankly no women on the faculty. You begin to have feminist liturgies that are expressed. I just received this week a work, Tefillah to Adam, the New Israeli, not American, but Israeli Reform prayer book that are edited by two women, Dahlia Marks and Alona Lasita, who are two of our HUC graduates in Jerusalem. Dr. Marks received her PhD from the Hebrew University, and Alona received hers from Tel Aviv University in Talmud. This prayer book is a direct reflection of feminist thought, and among the people they thank are Marcia Falk, whose work has come to influence Reconstructionist and Reform prayer in highly significant ways. The whole move towards inclusion that we have and outreach in the Reform Jewish world in particular today are completely the result of many of the essays written, quite frankly, by people like Professor Magid. The whole move towards spirituality. If you have a healing service ever at your congregation, that is direct outgrowth of the work of Rabbi Nancy Flam. It's hard to believe that these things did not exist earlier on, and I could go on, but I think I want to say that on an emotional level, many of the trends, the trajectories in American Jewish life today are a reflection of the thoughts that were put together or put forth by many of these thinkers, certainly in regard to the inclusion of GLBTQ persons and their voices in the American Jewish community today. The work of Rabbi Stephen Greenberg, Wrestling with God, which was the first formal expression of an affirmation of gays within the American Jewish community. It had quite literally a seminal impact, and the impact of our women thinkers, I want to be gender equal, has certainly been an ovular one, so that we've had seminal and ovular Jewish thinkers within our world today.
So another question has come in from Kay, noting that their late cousin was Rabbi Emanuel Rachman, who devoted a lot of effort to giving women rights in Orthodoxy.
Absolutely.
And wondering if in Orthodoxy, you're starting to see changes that reflect American influences.
Well, that is a great question. I want to say that my admiration for Rabbi Rachman is literally unbounded. He is an individual whose works we mention at the end of this book in our bibliography. He could well have been included within the book. But Rabbi Rachman, among other things, ultimately served as the chancellor of Bar-Ilan University. He was not selected to be president of Yeshiva University. That was Rabbi Norman Lamb. So then Rabbi Rachman took this other position. By the way, I'll just tell an anecdote here. And Adam, it might have been almost the year you were ordained. During my second or third year as president of the college, we gave an honorary doctorate to Rabbi Rachman because no one had done more on behalf of the Agunah, the chained woman, who was not allowed divorce from the standpoint of Orthodox Jewish law. Rabbi Rachman was an individual who attempted to resolve that problem on behalf of women. And there is an institute at Bar-Ilan University today that attempts to free these chained women from the bonds that there being an agunah, there being a chained woman imposes upon them so that they can remarry. I offered Rabbi Rachman a doctorate from the Hebrew Union College, an honorary degree. And at first he said no. He said, I'm very appreciative of the honor, but as an Orthodox rabbi, I can't really accept this honor from Hebrew Union College. So I sent Rabbi Rachman an article I had written on an Orthodox rabbi in Germany who was extremely tolerant of Reform Jews and liberal Judaism. And I sent it to Rabbi Rachman, and I wrote an inscription, and I said to Rabbi Rachman, who walks in the steps of this tolerant German rabbi. Then immediately I received a phone call from him, and he said, okay, Nitzchuni, you've defeated me. I'll accept the doctorate. And he said, I do want you to know that the Jewish Theological Seminary offered me a doctorate, and I did not take it. That's because many people accuse me of being a conservative and not a Orthodox rabbi. But he said, even my harshest critic never calls me a Reform rabbi. So I'm able to take the degree from Hebrew Union. But many of the directions that Rabbi Rachman put forth in terms of the desire to include women within the Orthodox world, and that Blue Greenberg, who is in many ways the mother of Orthodox Jewish feminism, many of their influences are felt in our day. Women now study Talmud often within the Orthodox Jewish world. There is a yeshiva in New York, Yeshivat Maharat, that ordains Orthodox women. So Orthodoxy too cannot be shut off, cannot seal itself hermetically from these issues in the larger world. And in light of the earlier question, it genuinely reflects the influence that thinkers have upon the directions that the American Jewish community takes.
So kind of building on that, I'm curious because Rabbi Rachman is someone who I would classify as a modern Orthodox rabbi. And you mentioned that Orthodoxy is being influenced by these things. And clearly there are Orthodox thinkers who are part of this journey that you took us on from 1934 to today. But what about the other end of the Orthodox spectrum? Is there any voice or thought about Jewish thought there? Or is it separating itself more and more from this tradition that's existed since before the time of Maimonides of having great Jewish thinkers?
In large measure, we did not include what I would call Haredi thinkers, which is to say these ultra-Orthodox thinkers. That is because, and I should have said this book deals in large measure with the dialectical interplay between Jewish tradition on the one hand and modernity and modern ideals on the other. These Haredi thinkers tend to quite consciously reject the embellishments of modernity. Of course, in consciously rejecting them, they're aware of it. One shouldn't think that these Haredi thinkers live in splendid isolation from modernity. They're quite aware of it. We have one ultra-Orthodox thinker mentioned specifically in the book, and that is Joel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe. In the section on the Holocaust in Israel, Rabbi Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, wrote that the reason for the Holocaust was Zionism, that the Zionists violated the ethos of rabbinic Judaism that asserted that God would restore us to the land and that we people should not do it ourselves. As a result, Teitelbaum says God punished the Jewish people with the Holocaust. So the reason for the Holocaust, according to Rabbi Teitelbaum, is the creation of the state of Israel. We included him because his work is often quoted. We do mention people like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Hutner. There are a number of ultra-Orthodox thinkers who are included. And I believe the Brandeis Library of Modern Jewish Thought is considering writing another volume on ultra-Orthodox thinking. But for us, it fell beyond our definition.
Wonderful. Are there other people? So you said people posed the question to you, and you posed it to your students of who should be included. So are there people that, as you've been thinking about it and you've come across it, you wish, I wish we had an addendum. We could just add one or two more. Who would be on that list?
Well, I mentioned, I think there are feminist thinkers like Ellen Umansky. Brad Artson is an individual who's written a great deal about process, Jewish thought, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. There really are two sections our book does not contain that we're both sort of sorry that it doesn't, though the problem would be if we had included them, I don't know what we would have excluded. But we don't really have a section that deals specifically with interfaith relations. And that is an area where there has been a great deal of thought in both Orthodox and non-Orthodox circles. I think of the work of people like David Novak, my friend Michael Signer, who passed away a couple of years ago, who taught at Notre Dame. They wrote a work, David Sanmel, Dabru Emet, How Should Jews Think About Christianity in Our Day? Irving Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, has written a great deal on this topic, and we did not include it. In addition, we don't have a specific section on Jewish ethics. Now, having said that, there are a lot of writings in here that deal with issues of social justice. And in fact, if I can just say it today, we're having a meeting tomorrow with a couple of other colleagues to consider writing a volume that will be devoted to Jewish ethics alone. And it would also be published in this Brandeis series, but that's a couple of years away. So that those are areas where I do feel we could have, when I say we could have done better, we could have done better, but I don't know how, I don't know what we would have taken out. That's the challenge here.
So questions come in from the audience wanting to know, with these 7 subject areas that you've identified, how much are these areas focused upon for the clergy in training at Hebrew Union College today? And what are areas where you think we could be doing better in preparing our future leaders for the Jewish community?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question. Michael Marmer and I are teaching a course on our book, so I can promise you that 22 students at the Hebrew Union College currently in the 4th and 5th year are thinking about all of these topics. But I think in one way or another, these subjects are brought up in classes on Jewish thought at the College Institute. I do think, I mean, the question of training people, educating rabbis in our day and age, our community, in light of what I said about Shaul Magi and his notion of Jewish peoplehood, the question comes to be, how do we train people more and more to speak to the reality of an ethnically heterogeneous community? In other words, I'm 73 years old. I grew up in what I would call an Ashkenormative Jewish community in Newport News, Virginia. Everyone was of Eastern European Jewish descent, a couple maybe of Germanic Jewish descent. There were not persons of color. There wasn't a diversity in the community that we have today. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, quite frankly, there was virtually no intermarriage and frankly, no divorce in the community I grew up in. All of these represent differences. Also, people were very, very much divided along denominational lines. Today, those denominational lines, I don't know enough about, exactly how it works in Naples, but people are not necessarily as concerned with denominational labels today as they were a generation ago. And so you have all of these changes. And so in educating persons at the college, we try to take all of this into account. We also have a world where a number of our rabbis now consciously do not choose to take the steps that you and Rabbi Boxman and the Cantor have taken, and they desire to go to work in Hillel. They work in chaplaincies, both in hospitals and in the military. Not everyone aspires to a congregation in the way they formerly did. And as a result, we need to take all of this into account. Also, the reality is the Cantor, and this is an important thing to say, has become a genuine co-equal partner, hopefully, with the rabbi in serving as clergy of our congregation. So the very way in which the cantorate is educated in our day, we think that there's been a significant upgrading in the overarching education that cantors receive so that they can serve in pastoral and other roles and as officiants in ways that may not have been expected again 30, 40, 50 years ago. Okay, maybe a last question or two. I don't know how long you want to go on. It's fine with me.
I would love to learn with you on and on, but I know that our audience is not ready for Shavuot just yet. So why don't we do two more questions, one from the audience and one from me, and I'll let you answer them in whatever order you choose.
Okay, great.
Sue asks if you can define peoplehood, because it's a very common term, and yet it's one that we really want to learn more about. And for me, I'd really like you to look into the future, pull out that crystal ball, and tell us, where is American Judaism going? Not in the hour-long version, but in the short 2-minute version, where do we see American Judaism going?
Okay, well, listen, the notion of peoplehood, there is the notion that goes all the way back to the Bible of Am Yisrael, or in Talmudic writings, namely the people of Israel. And obviously, when Ruth converts to Judaism, she says, Amech Ami, your people will be my people, Elohayich Elohai, and your God, my God. Judaism certainly has a peoplehood component that goes back as far as Judaism. But you need to know that the actual term itself was only coined by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan in the 1940s. The term peoplehood is an American invention, and it was created by Rabbi Kaplan because he was opposed to notions of Jewish nationhood. This was after World War I and World War II. He thought nationalism was inherently chauvinistic. He wanted to capture the notion of unity that marked people who were members of the Jewish polity, but he preferred the word peoplehood to the term Jewish nationhood. So consequently, Kaplan was the one to coin the term. I did not mention it, but we conclude the book with a selection by Noam Pianko, who is a young professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, who wrote a book on this whole concept of Jewish peoplehood, and he describes it. And he actually prefers a different term. He wants to use the term Jewishhood, not peoplehood, because he thinks there are many, many different ways in which Jews express their Jewishness, and that the idea of peoplehood doesn't fully capture, in Professor Pianko's view, the reality of who the Jews are as a polity, and that there are numerous ways to be Jewish, which leads me then into your last question. First, to talk about the future is a hazardous enterprise. But the nice thing about speaking about the future is I can't be empirically disconfirmed in what I'm about to say, because the future has not yet unfolded. But when I speak about it or reflect on it, I think you are going to have a community in which, to use Professor Pianko, Noam's term, Jewishness is going to be expressed in many, many, many diverse ways. That the Jewish community I grew up in, that was neatly divided between Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, where all Jews in my childhood belonged at least to one synagogue in the small town Newport News I grew up in Virginia, and all gave contributions to the United Jewish Appeal, I don't think that Jewish community is going to be present as we move into the 21st century. Simultaneously, I do expect our community to adapt to the kinds of challenges in the same way that you had to adapt to the reality of a Zoom world in which we've lived during this horrific time of COVID. Jews have proven to be resourceful, and maybe the way I'll conclude that are the lines of a thinker named Shimon Ravidovich. If you spell it, you get extra points on the exam. Rawidowicz, Simon Ravidovich. Professor Ravidovich is included in our book, and he wrote a famous essay entitled The Ever-Dying People. He was the first head of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis University when it opened in the late 1940s. And Dr. Ravidovich, in this essay, The Ever-Dying People, pointed out that every generation of Jews believed it was the last generation, as it were, après moi le deluge. After me, there's not going to really be a future for our people. But the reality is, he points out that the converse is also true. An ever-dying people is also an ever-living people. And the reality is that the actions we take can assure the continuity of the Jewish people, albeit that it may find different institutional expression than we've had in the past 100 years, but that I am confident that 80 years from now, someone who's going to write a book like this is going to be describing the thought of people like you in terms of what you did to make the Jewish people viable as we move into the 21st century. In this sense, then I want to actually wish you and the congregation, you, your rabbinic colleague, the cantor, a mazel tov on what really has been, Adam, 10 years of very distinguished leadership. The congregation is so blessed by you and the cantor and Rabbi Boxman, and it is always wonderful to see you. I want to say that students often love their teachers, but I want to just say to you, teachers love their students. And the pride I feel in you, the cantor and the rabbi, is just infinite. And I want to just thank you for taking the education that we were privileged to provide you at the Hebrew Union College, and for providing the insights, leadership, and inspiration to your people that you do. To you and to the whole community, I just want to say, HUC-JIR v'sameach, may you have a happy and joyous Passover season. So,
thank you, Rabbi Ellenson. That means so much to hear that from you. It was a gift to have you teach us tonight, as it has always been my honor to be able to be your student for so many years and learn from you in so many different ways. I think the only class we ever missed at HUC was how to do Zoom 101 and the virtual rabbinate. But we can't anticipate everything. As you said, trying to predict the future is a zero-sum effort because we're never going to win it. But you are. I always love that piece from Ravidovich about the ever-dying people, and that we continue to live on, and may we continue to take your teachings in our community and find inspiration and hope from them. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ellenson, for being part of this celebration of our 10 years. It means so much to me. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you again to the Kraus family for making this possible. Wishing you all a wonderful blessing. And don't forget to join us on Sunday night for the conclusion of our Decade of Distinction celebration with the concert Songs of Love and Light. We're going to have a lot of special guests who are part of that. It'll be a wonderful chance for Cantor and I to acknowledge and thank all of you for all that you've done for us over these 10 years, because truth be told, we couldn't be here if it wasn't for all of you. We are all Temple Shalom. We are all one family. So please join us again this Sunday night for that conclusion of our 10-year celebration. Thank you again, Rabbi Ellenson. We're saying goodbye to our friends on Facebook. say goodbye to the folks who are here. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night, everyone.